And thank you to everybody for having come, and especially for the invitation, for having me here this afternoon on this occasion. I feel very honoured and very happy to have been invited to deliver this talk. Happy indeed, because it made me think and rethink about my relation to the medieval ages. And what I've come up with will form the substantial bulk of my thoughts and words today. They seem to have nothing in common, 2 worlds apart, knights, kings, ladies, monks and peasants here, engulfed by an overawing nature entirely beyond control, living in constant fear of the planet's unknown and unfathomable wonders, afraid to fall from one of its edges into a gulf of monsters, into hell. They hope for paradise, snuggle close in sleep, cling to each other encumbered, live in one tight space, lacking even just the word for individual, at least in Middle High German, die of toothaches, have limbs sawed off without any antidote, witness death and sex from early age, share bed and pot, live at the grace of superiors, trying to believe into the divine order of the world, marveling at those who are better off, who live longer, who converse in Latin, stare at the stars, mix the elements, read books, read script. Sometime, one of them ventures out into the woods to catch a monster. Some sport hunting bears or boars. Flocks of men sell their bodies to warlords, or the families have done so long ago, and they too are tied into feudalism's narrow bonds. They know 50 words to differentiate people according to their positions in the family tree, brew beer and honeyed wine, die of toadstools and nightshade, deposed off into the mud, wasted, each one a flame easily extinct, indeed, whilst dreaming of love. And now this should work, but doesn't. Fallen asleep?
Weil das einmal da dran. Now try again.
Yeah. Thank you, Ulrike. Whilst dreaming of love, this idea imported in song from France, or devising some heroic and miraculous deeds, while listening to stories told by the fire in splendidly built courts, besides the skeleton structures of churches rising higher up to the heavens than anything man-known ever before. And it is like them, naked and exposed, tenacious and unfinished, craving for beauty. But whereas the stones only howl with the winds, they have started into another adventure, craving for words. A castle, a fortress, a court. Somewhere in Britain, in France, in a Germany whose map oddly resembles a scoop of granola, crunchy, interlocking bites of mini principalities. More than 800 years ago. And here, hordes of frequent flyers and constant travellers attached to handheld luminous screens, talking to air, coffee maniacs, media worker, we, the artificers of plastics and service, exploitation and artificial intelligence, keen to eventually be able to leave the earth, the planet, not its societies, wreaking havoc on nature, who keeps twitching uncontrollably beneath mankind's gigantic footstep. Never mind, ignore it, aggravate it, try to fight it, all simultaneously, acting as 3 persons in one, as 20. Divided into a multitude of identities, using 50 to 100 different passwords at least, living under various names in multiple roles, working and working and working, to creep back into one of these dens for singles for a supper from the microwave, gulped down while checking pictures and mails. We, addicted to contact at a distance, on the move, pressed, stressed, worried about diets, appearance, shape, watching accounts, watching bodies, improving bodies, scheming and dreaming of love, beyond the romantic love of commerce, dreaming of authenticity and sense, marveling at old stones that look like churches, looking for treasures anywhere, aware of what was lost, not knowing whether to regret it, finding ourselves enmeshed in huge conglomerate structures called economy, politics, or society that seem to work on systemic levels far beyond control or even only intelligibility. We, dreaming of truth, of sense, of beauty, of roots. Two worlds apart, indeed. Why bother with the Middle Ages? I didn't. I was interested as a student in the present, and I still am. Of course, the present is fiction. Anyone who ever read Hegel would know, or read other authors for this. But Hegel's discussion of the illusionary fluid nature of the present, as found in his phenomenology of spirit, is of specific interest, since it links the concept of now to body and language. The present is read by Hegel as a necessary, wonderful fiction of our physiology, an effect of the time structures of basic cellular processes. Inscriptions in salt, units or groupings in 3-second intervals. This, of course, is not in these words in Hegel, but he does bind his reflections on the yet, the now, to deictic words and their fluid, shifty meanings. Now, here, this, pointing your finger. Any present is imbued by what it itself is just about to become, the past. But how far would this past ever reach back? What difference does it make to reach back in time beyond one's own memory barrier? And then even to go further back from there for 20 years, 100, 800. My first question: how do we think about this difference in recuperating retro movements? Where are the watersheds? Where the unsurmountable or almost unsurmountable hindrances and difficulties? Things, or rather concepts, or rather thing bodily concepts, as for example the eye, which were implanted, if we take Jacques Lacan's word on this, unhintergehbar, that means deeply and beyond any questioning, into each of us as we acquired language. This is an image of Wolfram von Eschenbach. You see, he might be 2. He might even be 3. He might be 4. It just depends on what and how you count. My mother liked the name Isolde. It is a name of the past. That she liked it was, as I learned to suspect, one of the traces of the fact that she spent her childhood and received most of her schooling in Hitler's Third Reich. My father disliked the name. They compromised on Ulrike. Second name, my mother's choice. Third, my father's. This third name is another story, not for today. Let's talk about Isolde today. I came to Oxford when I was 22, studied law here for a year. Didn't really like it, but had to. Learned English, read Shakespeare, enjoyed life. Returned to Munich University and changed my studies to English and German literatures, to philosophy. Started writing. Auricularly, hiding it even from myself. First goes, just words. Single letters even. Connections and transitions were difficult. Important the gaps, extremely slow, me. I read texts in Old and Middle English. The story of Tristan and Isolde I knew as plot. I disliked Wagner's take on it. For formal reasons due to Munich's exam regulations, I found myself attending a beginner's course of Middle High German while I was already looking for a topic of my MA thesis in English. I sat in the last row, 60 students and more. I didn't listen, wrote an interpretation of a minute song by Heinrich von Morungen for the final test, and was invited to visit a seminar on Tristan and Isolde for advanced students, where I only went because of my name. And then, out of these many chances and few choices, this crooked path, not making much or any sense at the time, the story began for a second time, all over again. I thought I would catch 2 flies in one go, as German has it. I think it's birds over here, isn't it, and a stone? Well, I did. 2 flies in one go. I caught myself. Worlds apart. There I was, on my bed in a tiny apartment in Munich's Leopoldstrasse, reading Gottfried's Tristan and Isolde. The bilingual edition, actually rather just the translation. I kept on reading all night to the very last line. One word. Story and verse. Action and thought, tension and aggression, the complex architecture of thousands of lines, the mesmerizing wonders of variation and repetition. Something had crossed the line. The word transfigured into my head by reading was foreign, distinctly different, old, and topical in each verse. The topicality was hard to grasp. It basically seemed to reside in how the characters acted, how they were shown or given, and in the gaps, the turns the story took through Gottfried's craft. In what was not said, in what was suppressed, in the cuts, in the missing end, in the fact that the character's I or self was absent somehow. I remember the morning light after that night's read, the huge chestnut tree in front of my window. And wasn't it there, below the tree, Marcus' shadow, the king's jealous shadow, spying on Tristan and Isolde, who, warned by his moony, loomy reflection, immediately changed course and discourse? Cunningly they proceed, talking just for the king's ears, till he, the eavesdropper, is shamed by their faithfulness and loyalty to him. There we were, Marker crouching in the canopy, and me, immensely enjoying Gottfried's poetic craft of writing duplicitously. Isolde manages to confess her love to Tristan in words that Marker must take to mean him. This use of poetic means as a vital part of modeling a dramatic story intrigued me. There is a catchphrase I use, and you should never use this catchphrase in exams, but I can use it being a writer, can't I? There's a catchphrase I use when I try to explain to myself what I mean by the topicality just mentioned. Why did I feel so excited and alerted by this medieval text, and others were to follow, Hartmann von Auer, Wolfram von Eschenbach? My catch term is Kafka. Alas, what is this Draesner up to now, you might well think? Messing up everything. Indeed, and I assure you, Kafka as a code word is extremely useful. It stands in for a specific technique of narration. Never tell anything about your character's inner lives. Never explain and don't ever comment. This is the word of Kafka's The Trial. I rather like its German title though, Der Prozess, which means trial and process. So Kafka to me means to narrate the world as a process brought about by the actions of characters who may be human, animals, fantastic creatures, nature or the skies and heavens themselves, may be gods or sources from the past. Don't differentiate, don't order too much. Just stay outside, read bodies, retell symptoms. And be aware of retelling in telling. And again, don't comment, don't develop inner words in inner monologues, in close flight alongside the vision and emotions of a character. Just infer, tell what they might think, yes, and then again propulse this, translate this into some weird action. Kafka's world, where the I, as we've known it since the French Revolution and its tremendous consequences in our legal, psychological, social and cultural systems throughout Europe, becomes disabled, even maimed, by the presence of an overwhelming, anonymous, though lurking and ever-observing superstructure of functional non-I beings. Cruising epic words, writing the 12th and the 21st centuries. I left academia in 1992, but my interest in what the German epic world of the years 1180 to 1220 had alerted me to has lingered on as a question for my own writing, specifically of prose, today. First, how do I conceive of and handle the relationship of bound poetic language and prose writing? How do I rethink it, rejuvenate it, deal with rhythm and pattern building, with tone and music in prose? The epic and my extremely enjoyable cruising through its intertextually interwoven manifold words for my dissertation have left me, as I tend to think today, as a very stubborn writer, absolutely convinced that the separations between prose and poetry are fallacies, indubitably useful, but traps for a writer nevertheless. There is no prose without pattern, no prose without rhythm, no prose without simile, no prose without iteration, no prose without cascades of hopefully luring sound. My favorite example of this? Lowly light of my life, fire of my loins, my sin, my soul, lowly tar, the tip of the tongue, taking a trip of 3 steps down the palate to tap at 3 on the teeth, lowly tar. First sentence, Boccosolitaire, perfect meter. Second point, the obliqueness of any inner life rendered. This I non-I, this I being hatched, this I in a state of half-invention. Narrating inner words seems to have been under construction in the epoch I'm regarding, but it's far from having been accomplished. To those who know to read it, the literature of the time offers the rare occasion to witness the process of acculturation while it is being lived through. Songs and epics bear the imprints of this process. Let's look at Wolfram's Parzival entering a forest as a young boy. He carries his bow, listens to birdsong, and an amazing verse follows, absolutely unusual in its historic context. In response to the birds, Parzival feels a widening of his breast, his lungs, his rib cage, his heart, his emotions in general. Der Knappe, als es verborgen ward, zerfasste in Sultane erzwungen, an königliche Fure betrungen, es möcht an Eime Siete sehen, Bogen und der Hölzelin, die sneit mit sin selbes Hand, und schoss viel Vogele, die fand. Wenn aber den Vogel erschoss, der Schal von Sange war so groß, so weinte und raufte sich, an sin Haar kehrt Gericht. Sin Lieb was klar und fier, auf dem Plan am Revier, trug sich alle Morgen. Konnte nicht gesorgen, es wäre, ob in der Vogel sank, die Süße in sin Herze trank, dass es tragte im Sinü Brüstelin, allwein der Lirf der Königin. Sorry, yes. But then oh. There are few other instances of this newly invented, made-up connection between an event in outer real world and its bodily echoes beyond codified body language. I seem to remember that there was one in Gottfried's Tristan. Isolde is estranged by something about Tristan taking a step back from him. No words, just this, the movement of a leg, a foot. The non-codification, of course, is crucial. There's a wealth of body language, of bodily conveyed signs in medieval literature. Blushing and showing a pale complexion are well-known symptoms of love. There are gestures on the throne, gestures before and in combat, etc. But here we encounter bodily created and conveyed feeling of a unique individual character, taught to the audience by the epic itself. Which brings me to my third point. It relates to how we think about the individual and communality today. Where does the body end? Where does it begin? How deeply or fundamentally do we think to be separated from each other? The research I found done on swarm behavior seems to be fairly unsatisfactory. Funny too, because one easily sees how hypotheses ventured to explain the movement of a swarm of, let's say, herring trying to escape some hungry sharks, or a herd of bisons wandering the wide American plains in their specific wavy frontline pattern, how these hypotheses mirror fashions of scientific thinking. You can easily imagine that there were times when everybody favored a leader principle, though we had to rely on the wild assumption that there must be unfathomably fast signals going to and fro between the leader of the group and the rest. Today, there's a lot of talk about swarms or herds as systems that by nature seem to develop complex self-reflexive mechanisms of regulation. And it's a safe guess that in 30 years' time there will be another paradigm to explain what seems to be becoming a prominent and urgent topic now in the 21st century. The one amongst the mass, whom we prefer to call friends nowadays. Let's look at an example, at something as spectacular as a pedestrian zone. People move in two directions, one up, one down. This is Munich pedestrian zone. But who decides who is walking on which side? Because, as pedestrian zones all over the globe show, we tend to move in flows. It obviously is easier to get on if everybody heading in one direction moves on one side of the street. But if one compares pedestrian zones on, for example, south-north tangents, no pattern emerges. The south-north wanderers either walk on the left or right side, and vice versa, independently of the traffic rules of the place, but constant in that one place over decades. And people rather seem to be influenced by light and shade, by architecture and the texture of the ground. But nobody really knows, and nobody ever interviewed on this about his choice, was able to tell why she had decided to walk on the left or right side. I am interested in the fact that this direction grouping happens at all. We adjust, follow the flow without thinking about it. We get ourselves attuned. This, of course, happens in many areas of living. We are driven by a craving for communality, for unison, linked with each other far beyond knowledge and rational control. This explains how something like zeitgeist develops real impact. It happens on a very bodily level as well as within our minds. It has become a fairly well-known fact that menstruation cycles of women who live in closed environments, such as a camp or, more peacefully, a monastery, synchronize themselves. The process seems to be triggered and regulated via our olfactory sense. We smell the hormonal state of our fellow beings. We do with everybody, all the time, and we answer chemically. Our bodies are changed by it. We just don't notice. Back to 12th and 21st centuries writing. To me, the question of communality, the breed, the whole, conceived as comprising body and mind, is one of the foremost questions for literary writing today. How do I think a character? How do I make him or her behave, interact, be influenced? What might be the connections between people? I don't write family novels. They only look like family novels. In a way, of course, they are. Look at Sieben Sprünge. 2 families, 4 generations, 9 eye narrators. Honestly, it's hard to know what else you'd call a historical family novel. Nevertheless, there's a difference. I'm interested in family beyond language, independently of language even. This is my most recent novel, and the flapjack looks like this. It's a cloud of it. Where language fails, where messages travel that can't be voiced in words, cause of traumatization. The non-verbal exchange, communication via gestures, gaps, even concern events that were completely deleted from conscious memory. Too unbearable to be remembered at all, let alone to be put into a word, a phrase. They nevertheless pop up in symptoms of children or grandchildren. How do they travel? Here there might be stammers, audible silences, sighs, facial expressions. There seem to be imprints of emotional landscapes between the generations. There might be smells, epigenetics, genres unknown. Psychologists talk of post-memory or intergenerational traumatization. More can be found on the website to the novel. We don't really seem to know how these effects are brought about, but there is abundant evidence for the reality and strength of these inner familial concatenations. Communality. Living in a room, a house, a college, an environment shared. The medieval literature, I know, seems to illuminate these questions right from today's other side. This first became evident to me when I read Wolfram's von Eschenbach Willehalm. It is a strange epic that mainly consists of battles and their elaborate description. Very topical, though, as it deals with religious warfare between Muslims and Christians, rendering a comparatively open-minded, friendly portrait of the Muslim side, but also easily boring for a contemporary reader, reveling in interminable descriptions of tents, horses, knights, etc., just in order to feast in even longer descriptions of fighting and killing, movements, tactics, men advancing against each other relentlessly. It was Peter Czerwinski's book, The Luster of Abstraction, Der Glanz der Abstraktion, published in 1991, which first drew my attention to the specific character of Wolfram's descriptions. In contrast to his French source, Wolfram fathoms single bodies as one collective body, 1,000 legs as one leg. Bearing this in mind, even passages as the one in the Nibelungenlied, where Siegfried, hidden beneath the invisibility cap, wins the better of Brunhild because the cap endows him with extra power that he, in turn, uses in order to strengthen Gunther, read differently. Siegfried instructs Gunther, den Schild gib mir von Hände und lahe mich den tragen und merke rechte, was du mich hörst sagen. Nu hab du die Gebäre, du Werk will ich begann. In the scenes that follow, Gunther seems to be the one acting. Siegfried carries him on his arms by performing the jump Brunhild has set up as part of the competition. To us, Gunther would easily seem to be a kind of puppet, propped up by Siegfried. But Siegfried's invisibility might be truer than we would think at first sight. He is invisible because he, quite physically, becomes part of Gunther. By putting on the cap, Siegfried starts to impersonate numerous bodies, all of whom all of whom, becoming he, add up to become Gunther. Which is not weird, not as weird as we would think it to be, not only part of a magic word either, but part, closer part at least as today, of a life experience, founded in a day-to-day routine, which involved so much more immediate proximity to others' bodies than we would find bearable. A couple of months ago, I finished a rewriting of the Nibelungenlied, undertaken for a new edition of this song with Willehalm, consisting of my text and the Art Deco illustrations by Karl Otto Tschechka. The approach I chose: each of the protagonists, Kriemhild, Siegfried, Brunhild and Hagen, are given voice. Each recounts the story as it has evolved for him or her in 8 to 10 poems that vary from being very lyrical to being almost prose. They tell different stories of identity, of the incoherence of the self on self, of a world where it is conceivable to be two bodies, as happens to Hagen and the Spielmann, to redouble yourself in flesh. A world into which Minne is introduced and brings about a lot of shame, thereby focusing the eye onto itself. A world showing the painful process of moulding a being into something else individual. Some, as Hagen, collapse under the pressure created. It became evident to me when I read respective profiles that, phrased in our terms, Hagen runs amok in the end, a collective amok. And I want to pass a so-called maquette of this new Nibelungen book through the rows now, just to be there we are, between now and the world, spinning from a state where the word einzeln, single or unique, only existed for those who conversed academically in Latin, whereas everybody else lived in a language that didn't provide him with himself. Not quite. The term used today for Einersein existed in Middle High German, but had different connotations. It meant to be alone, and is most often used in connection with the hero who leaves the castle, riding off into a dangerous wood, awaiting adventures. Being one is essentially a precarious state. To be alone means to be in peril. You rather avoid it. And there it shines, one of these invaluable traces of us, still living as a pack, where communality is everything, and bodies stand in for each other in a way we, I strongly suspect, are no longer able to fathom. Let me briefly mention 4 more points connecting writing in the 12th and 21st centuries before I come to my conclusion. First, sources. Individuality is tied up to the open or clandestine use of sources, of quotes, material provided by others. Our writing is being changed by the use of media, and if it wasn't our writing that's affected, our reading certainly has been for quite a while now. The individual has become weaker and less central to our ideas and practices of living. Digital worlds revolve around communality, nets, being netted, being part of, befriended, be twittered. And they rely on everybody being able to be in many places simultaneously, on collecting people. We invest a lot of time, much more than in that prehistoric, pre-digital phase of terrestrial existence 20 years ago, just into the fact of getting and staying connected. Sources? Quotations? No, availability. Everything, everywhere, again and again. And this is quite close to medieval concepts. You cite a source, never mind its traceability. You need a source to embellish your talk, make it up if you don't have it. Other real sources you hide. Abundance in reading, picking. Writing as a challenge to mix intelligently, to play hide and seek, to digress artfully, Mix again, jump. Think in levels. There are 5 long, subtle, and 40 minor digressions in Gottfried's Tristan. Intertextuality everywhere. Postmodernism made real. Second point, orality. Of course, we don't live in an oral society, but the dominance of writing seems to change, not in fact, but in texture. We write spoken texts. We speak in writing. We Twitter and text. We tolerate typos, invent abbreviations, guessing and crypt. We are fast, don't reflect. We are thumbs. We are distant and rash. We communicate apersonally. Thereby, we've become more tolerant with ourselves and more regardless. Just send the stuff off. We talk, almost as if we talk to ourselves. We externalize our thoughts. We are faster, even faster. We write and talk in one. New forms of mixed, all-written writing come about. This sounds paradoxical, doesn't it? Written writing, oral writing. Indeed. There was a reform of orthography in Germany about 15 years ago. It was introduced when the internet and mobile phoning were growing rapidly. And this had a tremendous effect on our spelling. It ran wild, still does. We're almost back to German orthography in the 17th century. There's many words. There are many ways now in which to spell them that would be considered as correct or at least possible. What a change in attitude. And I myself am split. My handwriting follows different rules, just the old automatisms of the hand, than my typing. And all this, to me, are effects of an artificial kind of mimetic orality reintroduced into our daily communications, which of course has massive effects on the writing of fiction and poetry for that. It has always been a stage of advanced artifice to set up a convincing dialogue in a story. How do you go about it today? Well, obviously differently than 30 or even only 15 years ago. Artifice has to change when reality changes. The modes of translating this reality into fiction as reality might change in addition. So in truth, there is a twofold change. The challenge now, to create the semblance of an orality which in itself is already a quote of artificial orality, and often enough might be accompanied by the simultaneous use of digital media by the characters who are talking to each other while they are typing, and in this typing are reenacting or rebouncing orally on sentences just written in an artificially oral style of writing. Everything clear? Right, I thought I could trust an Oxford audience. Third point, very short, performance. It's linked to my second point. There has been more emphasis on reading, staging, performance of poetry and prose, on the event of literature, the singularity even of the event, the pack, the fire, the real thing. And fourth point, authorship. And there seems to be around more collective writing, film scripts, games, more anonymity in writing as well, exposure of some few names, anonymity for the rest of the authors. Anonymity as to copying rights and money. A fairly wide market, copy and paste. If authors want to live off their writings, they need sponsors. Very medieval consolations again. Now, I've got 2 conclusions for you. The first, a proper one to take home. The second, 2 yet unpublished Tristan and Isolde poems, one in English, one in German, to enjoy and take home. First, are we facing a medievalization of literary writing? In circumstances, in forms moving out of the narrow bed of individualism, and most importantly, in recognizing that literature is one of the very rare means to reflect, to rethink and to reenact communality in bodies and mind, beyond our set frames of mind, so heavily imbued by enlightened approaches crafted in the 18th century, which, last not least, shows what an important role literature can play for our understanding of political processes right now, concerning refugees and responsibilities, and communality in a space called Europe that geographically and culturally we share with this let's turn to Tristan and Isolde, these European travelers. Thank you to Ulrike for giving me this map. So I first read the German poem to you, which is wrong now. Here we are. And for those who don't know German, it's, just meditate, dream of, listen to the sound. Spirit Level Hermelin, Marke und die Geister des Bodens. Und immer wieder dies, sitzen im Baum und wägen Nägel. Level Spirit, trillernd ihm in die Hand gedrückt, Ballen des Fußes, für eine Frau importiert. Kaili, das Wort, das niemals Decke hieß, Seil ihm reicht, aus der Tasche durch den samtigen, in die Tiefe hängenden Tann. Tss, Marke, tss. Es ist ja nichts steil, nichts hier Gesicht. Kaili, Ballentanz über heißen Kohlen, ist aus der Nähe alles, das spricht, Taumel. Lemur, Marke im Baum, Marke in der Bratze der eigenen Spur, Marke der Hunde, des Windes, König, Roi, Marke am Telefon, Marke des Gerüchts, der Schatten auf Schatten wirft, die er nicht sieht, Marke neu, dieses Ich, also auch und. Hermelin am Fuß des Stamms, das in Träume tiefer nachts atmendes Fell ihm reißt. Sie nennen es Zauber, er nennt Dolde, es spricht Riot ihr nach, Wurzel gefangen in der Blase des Stabs. Zwischen der Linde Holz, das Schüppchen Luft, das Auge er nennt. Marke am Boden der Geister. Was er verwechselt? Richtet jemals von selbst sich Gewicht? Die Geister läppern nur mehr, nagen an den Rubinien, Nester im Hof. Er wünscht zuckenden Äser, willfährige Blume, sich des Hasen, kaum gefaltetes Gesicht. Um zu verzeihen, gib Leine, der Weiße, dem Segel, der Hand. Horizont nennen, Glücksphase, dies des Ichs. And this is the manuscript of the English poem. But there is a proper version as well. Old, fresh. It was the house where slugs sprawled themselves in through the oblivious nothingness of a slit beneath the kitchen door. There they were, bulging domes, slimy brown. I had known this to be part of the miracles of natural scales, which it wasn't, not registered. I had known how many words there would be. Slug and snail, and a vital difference, shell, so-called, wall, brought to its nails. It was the house where the windows dropped wet each morning inside, where mould wasn't a question, and the wind outside a gust fell on thighs a split second later, the house, whose windows had to be cleaned whenever, with a long stick and watery end from outside reaching up, as if stirring pie into the sky. The house, through which the hooting of the boats sounded shortly before and after midnight, canopied by the communal coaxing of wild geese crossing the equinox, each direction, the one wearing its ring, the other one. Which was to be understood as equivalently equivocal to the hooting of the house in any of our bones, in our dreams, in all these years to come, as it turned out, that it was impossible to ever leave her or leave it, having lived there once, close to a king's bonfires, vocalized is how it is. I, wild slugs, snails, sluts of all sorts, snuck through the invisible crevice between seer and soul. Thank you.